Hello and welcome to HCI 509, Research Methods. And in this lecture, Lecture 6, we're going to talk about experimental design with a single independent variable. First, let's take a 3-question quiz to test our understanding so far. So the first question asks, why do we perform experiments? And there's 5 possible answers. I'm going to let you pause it here and come up with what you think is the purpose behind performing experiments. The first one, A, to satisfy a human subjects committee. Yes, we have to do that, but it's not the purpose behind the committee. It's more of a means to an end as opposed to an end in itself. To prove a theory, now that might be a byproduct of an experiment, but it's not necessarily the purpose behind it. To describe a phenomenon, that's more of a descriptive research problem as opposed to a purpose behind an experiment. To identify causal relationships, that sounds pretty good. And the last one is to identify relationships between multiple factors. So between D and E, D gives us a better idea of why we're going to perform an experiment. We're trying to show some kind of cause-effect relationship between some features that we're trying to introduce, some treatments, and the outcomes. So that is the best answer. Here's a second one. It's true-false. Designing an experiment is just writing a hypothesis. True or false? We talked about hypothesis testing in a previous example, but let me pause it here and let you take your own best guess as to whether this is true or false. It's of course false. Writing the hypothesis is just one step in the whole experiment process. There's a whole bunch more involved with an experiment than just coming up with what we're going to test. Now the third question, which of the following is a valid use for experiments in HCI? You can see the 5 choices here, and I'll pause it and let you make your decision. So A is certainly plausible, and B is certainly plausible, and C certainly plausible. So it looks like D, which includes A, B, and C, is the best answer. Let's talk about different types of studies. Now, we identify 3 different groups of studies. There's true experiments, then there's quasi-experiments, and then there's non-experiments. And what do we mean by these 3? So quasi-experiments and non-experiments are typically not what we're most interested in, especially in research design. A quasi-experiment involves multiple groups or conditions, but there's no random assignment to different conditions. When there's no random assignment, there's a lot of bias involved, but at the same time, there's some elements of experimentation where we have multiple groups or conditions that we're examining. The non-experiment is where you have only one observation group or only one condition. So this does not allow us to experiment or change certain independent variables to examine a condition. So the observation group, remember that's the unit. In HCI, these are typically humans, and they're in a sample that's representative of the overall population. Then we also have conditions or treatments, and these are the different techniques or devices or procedures that we want to compare. So these are the different elements of the experiment that we're going to alter to see how that changes our outcomes. This leads us to true experiments. These are based on at least one testable research hypothesis, and its purpose is to either validate that hypothesis or refute it. So there are usually 2 separate conditions. There could be more. We have one that's a treatment condition and a control condition. Sometimes we call it a treatment condition and a baseline. And then we have groups where we have one or more treatment groups, and then we have a control group. There's dependent variables, which are normally measured quantitatively. We like quantitative measurement, even when we're doing things that could be more qualitative. And we'll explain that more as the course goes on. Dependent variables are what we're going to measure to test to see whether the treatments or the independent variables are making a difference in the outcomes. We typically analyze these results using statistical significance tests, hence the need for quantitative numbers. Statistical significance tests, the stronger ones, use numeric values because they're easier to compare than qualitative types of variables. They're also designed and conducted with the goal of removing potential biases. So they should also be replicable, meaning we could replicate it under different conditions and groups. So if I conduct an experiment and I provide enough detail in terms of what I've done, someone somewhere else should be able to repeat using the same steps and receive a similar outcome from the same experiment. So if we were going to look at a kind of a decision tree of different types of study designs, there could be multiple groups or conditions. If there are, meaning we're having multiple groups or multiple conditions, then we would look at following it to the left. In that case, we look at randomization of assignments. And if there is randomization of assignments, we go to the left, and that shows it's a true experiment. If there is not randomization in terms of assignment of treatments, then what we would have is a quasi-experiment. Now, if we don't have multiple groups or conditions, basically what we're doing is we're making an observation. When we're making an observation, we cannot call that an experiment. Let's look at basic design structure. So the general scope is we want to come up with a research hypothesis. And we talked about that last week. The research hypothesis is one where we have the null and the alternate hypothesis. Remember, these need to be very clear, lucid statements that indicate a specific treatment on a specific population or sample. Then, after we come up with a research hypothesis, a null and alternative that are mutually exclusive, we can draw the general scope of the experiment. So we need to have a reasonable estimate of the timeline of the experiment and also the budget. So typically there's a trade-off between time and money, just about every aspect of life. If we have more time, we don't need to have as much money. And if we have more money, we don't need to have as much time. Now, there's lots of exceptions to this kind of heuristic, but the idea is the timeline of the experiment should be fairly short in a perfect world. And then also the budget should be as little as possible, just because it's difficult to fund a large experiment unless you're doing it on somebody else's dime. This leads us to some guiding questions. So we need to answer two specific questions here. How many independent variables do we want to investigate? And how many different values does each independent variable have? Let's take a look at one example hypothesis here. There's no significant difference between the target selection speed when using a mouse, a joystick, or a trackball to select icons of different sizes, small, medium, or large. So there's two independent variables. One is the device that you're using, mouse, joystick, or trackball. And the other one is the size of the icon, small, medium, or large. And so for the pointing devices, there's three values. And then also there's three conditions for this independent variable. And also there's three different font sizes. So to do a study like this, we would have to evaluate the mouse on small, medium, and large, the joystick on small, medium, and large, and trackball on small, medium, and large. So we have 3 times 3, or 9 different combinations that we need to consider. So how many independent variables do we want to investigate? The more we have, it's going to affect how long the experiment takes to run, because it's going to involve more complexity to both run the experiment and analyze it. And also, it's going to require more subjects to be involved with the study in most cases. So if we have just one independent variable, we call this a one-level design. If there's 2 or more, it's called a factorial design. So we could have 2 factorial or 3 factorial, and so on. And then how many different values does each independent variable have? In the previous example, we saw we had 2 independent variables, each with 3 values. So that determines the number of conditions needed in the experiment. Let's take a look at kind of a decision tree about defining a basic structure of a study. How many independent variables do we have? If it's more than 1, then we have a factorial design. So remember the study we talked about last week where we were comparing Dvorak and a QWERTY keyboard to do a task? We only have 1 independent variable, and that one would be considered a basic design. Then we would have 2 conditions, right? The 2 conditions would be the QWERTY keyboard or the Dvorak keyboard. Now with a factorial design, this is where we have multiple independent variables, just like on the study we talked about just now. We have to consider the number of conditions, and of course this makes the test quite a bit more complicated to analyze later on. So for the remainder of this lecture, we'll look at basic design. This is where we have only 1 independent variable. Look down at the bottom, there's still a decision we have to make between group and within group, and I'll explain what those are in just a second. So we're going to look at the single independent variable here, and let's go through a couple of examples and try to tease out what those independent variables are. This is null hypothesis A. There's no significant difference in typing speed when using a QWERTY, a Dvorak, or an alphabetically ordered keyboard. Those alphabetically ordered keyboards are like what you'll see when you have all the letters A, B, C, D, E, F on one row, and then they're all in order. Sometimes those are faster to type, sometimes slower, and this would be a study to see how this typing speed differs between these 3 different types of keyboards. Let me allow you to pause the video here and tease out the dependent and independent variables and the conditions for this hypothesis statement. So the dependent variable is the typing speed. The independent variable is the type of keyboard. So the QWERTY, the Dvorak, and the alphabetically ordered. So we have 3 different conditions, 1 independent variable, and so this would be a single independent variable with 3 conditions. Let's look at another example. This would be null hypothesis B. There's no significant difference in the time required to locate an item in an online store between novice users and experienced users. So let me allow you to pause the video here and try to examine what the dependent, independent variables are and the conditions. The dependent variable is the time required to locate an item. So this might be shopping for a blender on Amazon.com and Walmart.com. The independent variable would be the types of users, and we have 2 types, novice and experienced. With a study design, you'd want to have a better idea of defining novice and experienced. We wouldn't just leave it to this, we'd have to define this further. Here's a third example, null hypothesis C. There's no difference in the perceived trust towards an online agent among customers who are from the US, Russia, China, and Nigeria. So there's an online agent that they're working with, say, to book tickets, and these are customers located in one of 4 countries. What are the dependent and independent variables and the conditions? I'll pause it here and let you tease these out. Well, the dependent variable is the perceived trust. This is tricky because we want this to be a quantitative variable. So we're likely to do this in a Likert scale. The independent variable would be the country of origin. So the customer's location or where they're from. And then there's 4 different countries. So these are mutually exclusive and there are 4 conditions. So this leads us to a question that we'll consider through the rest of this lecture. Between or within group design. Now, if you remember going back, we had that chart, and the chart had between group and within group at the bottom. And so we need to talk about what that actually means. So once the conditions are set, the number of conditions to which each participant will be exposed needs to be determined. So let me give you a little bit of thought behind this as we go along. Let's say we have a study where we're looking at keyboards and we're trying to see how fast somebody can perform a task. And we have 3 different conditions. You have 1 independent variable, which is the type of keyboard, 3 different conditions, the QWERTY keyboard, the Dvorak keyboard, and the alphabetized keyboard. And so we have 3 conditions. One design is to have each participant try out each of those 3 and then time them on a task. Another one is to divide each of the participants or units, human subjects, into 3 different groups. And each participant would only have to do a task using one of those 3 keyboards. So that is what we're going to use to determine whether it's a between or within group design. So this is pretty important because there's a lot of trade-offs between and within groups. So this decision directly impacts how good the data is coming out, as well as what types of statistical methods we're going to be using to analyze the data later on. Depending on the number of conditions, we'll either have a between group or within group. And again, as I explained, if we have each participant try out the 3 conditions or the 3 keyboards, that would be one way to do it. The other way would be to have and divide the participants up into 3 groups, each one trying out only a single keyboard. Let's talk about the within group design first. It's also called a within subject design. It requires each participant to be exposed to multiple experimental conditions. So that's having each participant try out each of those 3 keyboards. You can understand it's going to introduce a lot of design issues because we need to make sure that each participant doesn't go through them in the same order. We have to vary the order at which they're using the keyboards. So only one group of participants is needed for the entire experiment. Here's an example. We talked about this different types of keyboards. The null hypothesis is there's no significant difference in typing speed when we're using QWERTY, Dvorak, or the alphabetically ordered keyboard. So we have one group using all 3 types. And if we're trying to have them type a document of 500 words, then each participant's going to type 3 documents. And again, we're going to vary the order at which they use the keyboards, but at the same time, they're doing 3 times the work as a between group design would do. So getting to that is the between group design. It's also called between subject design. And each participant only has to do one of those 3 conditions. So the number of participant groups corresponds to the number of experimental conditions. However, keep in mind this requires 3 times the number of participants, but each participant only has to do 1/3 of the work. Our null hypothesis might be there's no significant difference in typing speed when using QWERTY, Dvorak, or alphabetically ordered keyboards. So each group of participants only uses one specific type of keyboard. And then if it's the same task as we described with the within groups, each participant's only going to have to do 1/3 of the work. So let's talk about the benefits and detriments of each one. So the between group, the advantages are that it's a cleaner design. So the between group is where we have 3 times as number of people, but they're each doing one task. So it's a cleaner design because we don't have to worry about certain types of biases. So it avoids what we call the learning effect. Let me illustrate. If I'm typing a 500-word document, the second time I type that document, I'm going to be better at it than the first time. And the third time, I'm going to be better at it the second time. Since we're only exposed to one condition in the between group, we don't have to worry about them typing the document 3 times, so they're not learning from previous attempts at the task. The time it takes each participant is shorter. Keep in mind when you're hiring participants or trying to coax them to join your experiment, convincing them to do a 30-minute experiment is different than convincing them to do a 90-minute experiment. Also, they're not going to be as tired. They're not going to be as frustrated. So we have better controls over those with a between group design. There's disadvantages as well. So the results are going to be more dependent on the individual differences between people because we can't see how one participant performs on 3 different keyboards, for example. This is going to influence our ability to test the different types of keyboard in that type of study. And because the performance comparison is between one group against another group, we're assuming that all people, if we get enough subjects, they're going to be minimizing the number of individual variances between the input. We'll talk more about that later this week. It requires a much larger sample size, which can be difficult to recruit. In HCI studies, these are particularly difficult because it's hard to get participants to do certain kinds of studies. Individual differences can cause more noise. So if you can think about perhaps some friends or people you know and talk about different types of tasks that they may be good or not so good at, you can see that there's more individual differences when you have more participants. And they're each doing a single task as opposed to doing 3 tasks where you can kind of better identify their abilities because you're looking at if they're not good typists, they're not going to be good on any of those 3 keyboards. And you'll be able to see that kind of balance between them if you do the within group as opposed to the between group. With the between group, if they're assigned, for example, the Dvorak keyboard and they do really, really poorly, it's going to bring down the average of the Dvorak keyboard's numbers. And that may be due to their typing speed, not due to the Dvorak keyboard. So this is going to introduce more type 2 errors. We have to be able to exclude the noise. So we need many more participants under each condition than we would with the within group. On that note, the within group advantages are they require a smaller sample size because we only need 1/3 typically with that example study than we would with the between group. In HCI, it's kind of hard to find qualified participants, not just participants, but qualified participants. In a lot of HCI studies I see, they use fellow graduate students in the HCI department as participants. Now, if you had to recruit far more participants, it's going to be more of a challenge. This will reduce the cost because typically you have to compensate the participants somehow. And if you say offer them $10 to take the test, when you have more participants, it's going to require more cost. It does not suffer from individual differences as much. And the expected difference can be observed with much smaller sample size. With the 3 conditions, it could be 1/3. Now, there's also some disadvantages. The biggest problem is the impact of learning effects. Since we're looking at participants completing the same task under multiple conditions, it's very likely they're going to learn from the experience and get better at the task. So the first assignment is going to be slower than the second and the third, regardless of the keyboard. This is what we call a learning effect. So, for example, we talked about ATMs experimenting with a button interface and a touchscreen interface. So if we have them do a task using one of those and then change to the other, the second time they do it, they're going to be faster regardless. And so this learning effect is different for different types of people, but it's also a bias that we have to consider. Again, getting some experience, and the second time they do it, they're going to be faster. And they may perform better if they do the second one with the touchscreen after doing the button one. We can kind of address this with the Latin square design. So we can vary which of the conditions each person is using, and this helps minimize but not eliminate the learning effect. So another one is fatigue. If we ask somebody to type a 500-word document and they're doing it 3 times, the third time they do it, they're going to either get tired or they're going to say, what am I doing? Why this? I have better things to do. And so this is going to affect the time if that's the dependent variable we're trying to evaluate. So unlike the learning effect, fatigue is actually going to negatively impact performance. As they get tired, their time is going to be adversely affected, and this is going to show that their performance is declining. And we may not have this type of effect if we have a between groups design. So think about if we always do the touchscreen after the button interface with the ATM experiment, we may draw a wrong conclusion that the touchscreen is not as effective. Now, with an experiment like the ATM experiment, where we have 2 competing like an A/B test, it's easy to address this, but there's other types of studies where they have to do things in sequence or in serial, and so we can't alter the order as easily. And that's where we're going to see this fatigue. Okay, so like I mentioned, the Latin square design can help avoid that because it helps randomize which of the 2 interfaces or the 3 conditions, if we're talking about keyboards, that they're given first, second, and third. So one way to get around the learning effect is training. So many types of tests, not all, but many, the learning curve is steepest when you have the first interaction with a particular task. So think about when you learn how to ride a bike, learn how to drive a car, learned how to do specific HCI related tasks on your own. In the beginning, maybe you were a little bit frustrated, but you learned faster. You made a lot more progress relative to where you started in the initial stages than later on. So what happens is your learning kind of plateaus. And the best way to test, for example, the keyboard or the ATM, is when you're kind of at that plateau, because it gives you more of a balance, right? There's going to be less learning effect and there's going to be less outside bias. So that's where we want to be. So if we can give the subjects more time to train on a device or do a particular task, it's going to reduce the learning effect. And this is actually going to have the detrimental effect because it's going to require each subject to take longer to do the task, which means you're going to probably need to compensate. So it's also going to increase the fatigue they may face. So that's the converse to this. And another thing is it's not going to completely eliminate the learning effect. It's just going to try to mitigate it. So how do we address fatigue? So one way is to design experiments more frugally, reduce the number of tasks or the length of the tasks that they're required to do, shorten the experiment time whenever it's possible. And the length of a single experiment session should not be more than 90 minutes. Think about yourself doing a particular task. If you're doing some kind of experimental task that's not really something that you're passionate about, such as typing a document, then it's going to be a little bit painful to go through a 90-minute task, especially if you're having to do some kind of training in the beginning. If it's longer than 90 minutes, that's the length of a typical Hollywood movie, it's going to lead to frustration or boredom or tiredness from your participants. So during that experiment, you should offer them an opportunity to take a break. You'd be surprised. Even offering to take a break, most participants are not going to take the break. So it might have an effect of making it more likely that they're going to push through. So here is a summary of the advantages and disadvantages of each type of experimental design. We talked about between group and within group. You can see neither one is without advantages and neither one is without limitations. So this makes it more challenging to pick a study design. So which one should you choose? Now, we have to consider that the advantages of disadvantages are opposite of each other. The strengths of one are the weaknesses of another. This makes it kind of challenging to do. Each experiment is unique, and the decision should be made on kind of a case-by-case basis with the full consideration of the context of the experiment. Some cases, you might want to consider both within and between group factors. And this is something we'll talk about in the future. We call this a hybrid design. So let's talk about some general considerations for between group design. This is a good idea when you have simple tasks with limited individual differences. You have tasks that would be greatly influenced by the learning effect. And then you have problems that can't be investigated through a within group design. So let's take a look at one that would be impossible. Again, remember this null hypothesis where we have the difference in perceived trust between customers who are from one of 4 different countries. A within group design is not appropriate. We can't change their origin. We can't say, okay, now you're from the US, now you're from Russia, now you're from China, now you're from Nigeria, because that's just not possible with this within group design. Under the circumstances, we really can only do a between group design. So each participant is going to be from one of these 4 countries. We're not going to say one participant's going to be from the US first, then Russia, then China, then Nigeria, because it just doesn't make sense for this experiment. So with the within group, it should be adopted when you have large individual differences. So that means different typing speeds, different skills, different individual choices. It's also less susceptible to the learning effect. And also when the participant pool is really small, because remember, this is the one where we have one participant doing all the different conditions. So this requires us to recruit far fewer participants. I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you on the next lecture.